Donald Trump calls it a crisis of the heart and a crisis of the soul. The U.S. president appealing directly to citizens and their emotions, arguing that Congress should agree to spend $5.7 billion for a border wall with Mexico. We'll review his arguments and ask what's at the root of his decision to refuse to sign the federal budget and trigger a shutdown that, come the weekend, would be the longest in U.S. history. We'll see how much America has changed since the great shutdown of 24 years ago under Bill Clinton's presidency. The rest of the world is watching this one. The stakes are high. Trump's appeal is about migration and identity politics, and it's also a power play with lawmakers in general. Will a president who this week again called journalists the enemy of the people succeed in tapping into a broader erosion of trusts in institutions? On that score, could he lose the battle and win the war? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Trump's shutdown. Joining us from the Washington suburb of Arlington, Virginia, is Andrew Good of the advocacy group Numbers U.S.A., which supports Donald Trump on tighter border controls. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Former U.S. diplomat, Ambassador Jeffrey Hawkins, is with us as well. Nice to see you. Jen Schrady teaches at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Your upcoming book, The Revolution That Wasn't, How Digital Activism Favors Conservatives. We'll be talking about that. And from New York, Sherri Berman, who teaches political science at Barnard College, part of Columbia University. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. By the way, Trump's first ever primetime televised speech from the Oval Office was Act 1. On Thursday, the U.S. president travels to the border. More on that from Solange Mougin.
In the run-up to Donald Trump's first primetime address from the Oval Office, Americans waited to see if new measures, such as a national emergency, would be announced. But the 9 p.m. speech instead was a repetition of his plea to build a wall on the U.S.'s southern border.
Some have suggested a barrier is immoral. Then why do wealthy politicians build walls, fences, and gates around their homes? They don't build walls because they hate the people on the outside, but because they love the people on the inside.
For 9 minutes, the president described his view of the U.S.'s immigration issues. He called the border a growing humanitarian and security crisis, putting pressure on Congress to spend $5.7 billion to construct a more extensive wall. Trump shifted the blame over the partial government shutdown that the border debate has caused.
The federal government remains shut down for one reason, and one reason only, because Democrats will not fund border security.
In their rebuttal, Democratic leaders struck down Trump's misleading claims on illegal immigration.
The women and children at the border are not a security threat. They are a humanitarian challenge, a challenge that President Trump's own cruel and counterproductive policies have only deepened. And the fact is, President Trump must stop holding the American people hostage, must stop manufacturing a crisis, and must reopen the government.
Trump's next move is meeting with congressional leaders to resume negotiations as they try to end the second longest government shutdown in U.S. history. And then on Thursday, he'll head to the Texas border to push for public support of his wall.
Andrew Good, you support the president?
We definitely support additional border barriers, but it's one piece of overall border security and an overall strategy to end illegal migration. The biggest piece that we want to see as an organization is mandatory E-Verify to cut off the jobs magnet. But that's not what's being discussed, unfortunately, in this particular discussion right here.
Not what's being discussed. Are you in favor of the shutdown?
Well, the shutdown is a political, it's a political tool. And you've seen both sides, both the Democrats and the White House have dug in their position, and it's going to need to be a political solution. Ultimately, there's either going to be some compromise or somebody's going to have to come off their line. We are a nonpartisan organization, so we want to talk about the actual, border barriers, what they've been good for, what Congress has done on them in the past, and maybe perhaps how we've gotten to this place where they are more controversial than they were even just a couple of years ago.
Because critics say there's an easy way to limit illegal immigration is to crack down on employers who hire illegal immigrants. Is that on the cards?
That's the promise of the 1996 amnesty, our first big amnesty, and the one that everyone thinks of when they think of immigration reform, kind of as a general term. And it's a promise that has never been fulfilled. Congress and past administrations have never fully acted. And I think now that we have the technology to do E-Verify, and now that we've seen that it works so well for so many employers that are using it in a voluntary fashion, I think it would be a very easy transition to make it mandatory for all employers in the U.S. And that's what we'd like to see happen.
Is this about the border, Jeffrey Hawkins, this shutdown?
Well, I mean, I guess yes, in a certain respect. I mean, it's about the president's desire to construct more walls along the U.S. border, and I mean, we know that there's already about I guess it's something like 650 miles of wall that's already there. There's a little bit of money there for some repairs and further construction. I guess the president wants to construct 1,000 more miles of walls. There's general consensus amongst most observers that that is not an effective way to deal with some of the problems that the president himself raised in his speech, particularly since the immigration and the illegal immigration and the drugs that he was so concerned about last night actually generally come through points of entry and not across the U.S.-Mexico border in places where remote. So building a wall isn't going to change things on the border, but the president seems to think that this is important. And so this shutdown that has been clearly imposed by the president on Congress and on not only Democrats in Congress, but Republicans in Congress is about border security in his own fashion and in his own way.
You agree it's about border security?
I think certainly Trump has made the wall a keystone of his platform from the beginning. But this is really accomplishing two things. It's rallying up his base, some of whom he's really encouraged the racism that is inherent in the building of the wall, especially the chance build that wall, in terms of who they're trying to keep out. But really, this is a case of deflection. Right? So there's this movie, I don't know how many of the viewers are familiar with the movie Wag the Dog. It came out about 20 years ago, where politicians use an attack or a war to deflect what's really going on. And really with the Mueller investigation and most of Trump's team being under investigation, including Trump himself, this has been a very convenient way for him to deflect the criticism and the potential arrests for him and others in his administration.
Yeah, Andrew, good. People are asking that because we're wondering, he calls this a humanitarian crisis. Last year, the U.S. stopped 400,000 illegal immigrants at the southern border, which is a big number by European standards, but just a drop in the bucket compared to if you look at the statistics from 15 years ago when it was much higher. So why is he picking this fight now, Andrew?
Well, I mean, I think it can't simultaneously be a core plank of his campaign and something that he is just using, grabbing at to do something in the moment to distract from something else. So I think we kind of have to deal with that first. But the border wall itself, yes, we have some in place already. And as I said before, the Congress and past administrations from both parties have added to the wall, starting with George H.W. Bush. But every single administration, every single president has added barriers during his term. And the most recent, I would say the most recent important piece of legislation very specifically related to fencing on the border was the Secure Fence Act of 2006, which passed 80 to 19. So I would say that there's a strong bipartisanship in the past, in the pre-Trump era, that kind of makes what we're seeing now politically something that we need to kind of analyze in a different way. But you mentioned the flows coming over the border and the difference in apprehensions, and I think you've seen some changes over the last few decades in those numbers and in the population that those numbers represent. When you think about, in the 90s, when they had a year where there was 1.6 million apprehensions, that was mainly male, mainly single worker, economic migrant types coming over, and they were immediately sent back. And you have these stories from Border Patrol in that era of people just trying over and over again, sometimes even a couple times
multiple
a day,
times, so that it
apprehended.
skews the statistics you're saying. I want to bring in Sherri Berman, who's with us from New York City and who teaches at Barnard College. What's your take? Why is this? It's the second year, right, of Donald Trump's presidency. We're entering the third year. Why is this coming to a head now?
Well, the wall, as some of your previous guests have mentioned, was a kind of keystone of his appeal and an important promise symbolically and practically that he made to his supporters. And so he recognizes that backing down on this might very well cause him to lose support among that very strong base that he has coalesced around himself in the last couple of years. And I think he sees this as kind of his Alamo, a sort of symbol of his ability to kind of get things done. And so he's willing to go to fairly extreme measures in order to force the Democrats' hand. I want to point out, as a scholar of democracy, that it is highly unusual for a president or anyone else to shut down or to threaten to shut down government simply because they cannot get a policy passed. I mean, that is pretty much part of the Democratic game. And basically saying, look, if I don't get my way, I'm going to sort of tip the board over, is really not the way politics is normally done. And so, again, I think what we're seeing here is Trump's calculation that not only can he get the Democrats to fold, but that if he doesn't push this through, that he himself will suffer politically.
And how much would you say that this shows how much the U.S. has changed under Donald Trump?
Well, I think it shows a bunch of things, actually, with regards to that. One is how very much he is playing to his base and not to a broader cross-section of the American public. I mean, surveys make clear that his views on immigration are the views of his core supporters, but don't reflect the American population, I think, more generally. And also, again, that he's willing to engage in very divisive and unusual behavior to get things done. That is to say, not playing by the standard democratic rules of the game. And I think this reflects, again, significant changes that have happened since he's become president and a significantly different way in which he plays the political game than his predecessors have.
Are we underestimating Donald Trump, Jeffrey Hawkins? Here's a man who understands perhaps that you don't need a majority, and we're finding it out here in France necessarily. You need a fired-up base.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. And the irony of this, and I think your first guest sort of alluded to this in some ways, is that wall is a symbol. And it's nothing more than a symbol as a tool for, if you really believe that immigration is a problem in the United States, that illegal immigration is a problem and you've got to get it under control, there are a lot of much more effective ways to do that than to build a wall over 10 years or however long it's going to take for $5.7 billion to start with. It will end up costing much more than that. There are lots of other ways to get at that problem. And so the president has locked himself into this wall that's a symbol to energize his base. The shutdown, I mean, as we recall, Congress was ready to pass a clean continuing resolution to get government funded, and the president backed out of that at the last minute, and he backed out of it in response to some very narrow constituencies some criticism on Fox News, apparently, and Coulter and other fairly far right-wing people in the United States that were criticizing him for not doing something about, and so he backed off on this. I'm not sure that this is a winner for the president. I don't think it is at all. I think he's backed himself into a corner
let me put this
over something that's not really important to people that really care about immigration.
Let me put this to Jen Trady, because your remit is to look at how social media shapes the public opinion. So you have what? On the one hand, outrage, right, over the treatment of, say, poor people who are desperate and are coming from places like Guatemala, where there's lots of gangland violence and where there's a lot of poverty. And on the other hand, those who fear a quote-unquote foreign invasion. Which wins the day on social media?
That's the million-dollar question, and some of it depends on how you measure it. In my research, what I found was that conservatives do tend to dominate online, which is very unlike, I think, our initial ideas of the Obama campaign or some left protest movements that initially were able to harness the web. But in this case, you not only have the Fox News conservative media that goes beyond Fox, by the way. There's a whole vast evangelical Christian social media as well. And you have a very funded right-wing array of organizations, really a digital media ecosystem that is able to push out this information. On the other hand, people are not dupes and stupid just reading and believing anything that they see. There's also, what's really important to remember is there's a whole array of grassroots organizations. Tea parties are still active. Far-right prepper groups, other patriot organizations, and other more moderate conservatives are able to see these online posts, comment on them, forward them, retweet them, repost them on Facebook. And so you do have this really strong conservative digital ecosystem.
And those get more traction than the right-wing ones, you say. We're going to pick up on that than the left-wing ones. We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
My name is Mandakini Gehlot, and I'm the France 24 correspondent in New Delhi. I cover news from India and other countries in South Asia. Catch me on our news bulletins from the region.
Mandakini Gehlot, one of the 200 France 24 correspondents around the world.
France 24, 4 news channels in 4 languages, 430 journalists, 35 nationalities, 160 bureaus around the world, a global reach. 355 million households and over 180 countries can watch France 24. 61 million viewers watch the channel every week, and the numbers are constantly growing, with audience figures up by 31%. France 24 online is also forging ahead. Over 18 million visits a month on France24.com. With 45 million videos viewed online, France 24 is a leader on YouTube, while our 37 million Facebook and Twitter followers make us France's #1 channel on social media. To our constantly growing community of viewers, thank you. How do artists and writers see the world? France 24's culture show takes you beyond the headlines, to the crossroads where the arts meet the news, and engage with what's happening in our lives today.
Encore, presented by Eve Jackson, on France 24 and France24.com.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories Laura Cillier is watching for you in the newsroom. Kinshasa on edge. The Electoral Commission to announce results from Congo's December 30th election results. 3 days overdue. A press conference has been scheduled for 11 p.m. local time. In the face of an oncoming storm, Malta allows the transfer of 49 migrants from a pair of rescue vessels. The asylum seekers have been stranded at sea for 19 days. The UK Parliament ups the pressure on Theresa May with passage of a bill that gives the Prime Minister 3 working days to come up with a plan B should her Brexit divorce deal fail next week. Here in France, the January sales kick off with retailers hoping to play catch-up. The Yellow Vest protests had consumers flocking online to do their Christmas shopping. We'll have all the day's business news with Kate Moody. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the shutdown in the United States, which is on track to be the longest in American history. We're talking about it with Andrew Good of the advocacy group Numbers U.S.A., which supports Donald Trump on tighter border controls. Welcome back, joining us from Arlington, Virginia. Joining us here in the studio, Jeffrey Hawkins, former U.S. diplomat ambassador, sociologist Jen Schrady, who teaches at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po, your upcoming book, The Revolution That Wasn't, How Digital
Activism favors conservatives.
Favors conservatives. Can't read my own handwriting. Oh, dear. And from New York, Sherri Berman, who teaches political science at Barnard College. The longest shutdown in U.S. history, 21 days. It was from December 1995 to January 1996. The president at the time was a Democrat, Bill Clinton. The Speaker of the House of Representatives was a Republican. His name was Newt Gingrich.
We owe our children and our country the Christmas gift of balancing the budget and reforming welfare this week. We have a 3,000-page bill we sent down to the president.
Sherri Berman, when you listen back to Newt Gingrich speaking at the time, you've already outlined for us one of the differences. In this case, it's the president who's on the offensive when it comes to the shutdown. At the time, it was the Speaker of the House. What are some of the other big differences, you'd say?
Well, actually, I'm glad that you played that clip because it is a fairly common understanding to see Trump as the kind of inheritor of the sort of divisive, in-your-face kind of politics that Gingrich pioneered precisely during that era, which is to say that, look, politics is not about negotiation, about compromise, about bargaining, about seeing the opposing party as one that differs from you but is still a legitimate opponent, but rather as the enemy. And when you're dealing with an enemy rather than an opponent, the kinds of tactics that you are willing to countenance change, such as shutting down the government. So, I mean, I think it's very important to see Trump both as a kind of, individual in and of himself and his presidency as something unusual in American politics, but also his trajectory is the inheritor of Republican tactics that date back at the very least to Gingrich. I think what we're seeing today is an acceleration of many of the trends from that era. We have an incredibly polarized electorate and an incredibly polarized Congress, again, that has a lot of trouble getting things done simply because bargaining and compromise has become an anathema to their bases. And this is more true of the Republican than the Democratic Party. That is to say that research consistently shows that Republicans in Congress in particular have moved further to the right than their counterparts in the Democratic Party have moved to the left. And so what we're seeing is the sort of checks and balances inherent in the American system have kind of gone almost into overdrive in the sense that it is very difficult to get things done without parties that can compromise, without Congress people that can compromise, without a president that's willing to give in order to get. And so what we're really seeing is an American government that's kind of sliding into dysfunction in a lot of ways.
Andrew Good, in part one of our discussion, you were hailing when in the past there was bipartisan support for immigration bills. Do you agree with Sherri Berman that Donald Trump is simply taking a leaf out of Newt Gingrich's very standoffish and offensive tactics?
Well, I think what you've seen with the phenomenon of Donald Trump being president, and I do think it's you could say that there's some differences and he's kind of unique in American history. But one of the most powerful things that he tapped into in order to ride into the White House is the issue of illegal immigration. And while there are a lot of aspects of immigration policy that deserve a transparent discussion and a very frank discussion, and then hopefully some things can be cobbled together that resemble a compromise. What we do know is that the vast number of Americans, I mean the vast majority, do not accept the ongoing situation of illegal immigration. And I think the bills that have failed in recent years, 2006, 2007, 2013, those bills failed primarily because the public did not really believe or trust that enforcement was going to happen and that we were not going to run into further illegal migration in the future. And I think there are aspects of, of hardening of positions. And again, especially in the Trump era, I think you've started to see, at least setting aside other issues, at least on immigration, you've seen the Democratic Party, portions of it have started to talk, more aggressively about being in favor of sanctuary policy, thinking about abolishing ICE, and really being out there talking about less immigration enforcement. And it's unclear how that's going to play out in the long term, but it definitely makes it difficult to, again, come to some kind of agreement now.
Was that a fair point, that that's a position that's too radical, Jeffrey Hawkins?
A couple of things about this. First of all, I'm one of the people that went through that initial shutdown, whenever it was 20 years ago. I don't think I was furloughed. I think I was still working without being paid. And the point I want to make about that is whatever differences you have on policy, whether you're, for being stronger on immigration or being more welcoming at our borders, holding both the employees of the federal government and the American people hostage is wrong, immoral in my view, and certainly not very fair to the people working for the government, who often do so under very difficult conditions and who don't make a lot of money. A lot of the people working for the federal government, these are not rich people, and they're living hand to mouth. And so when we have this polarized system where one party is willing to take the other party to war and use the government as a bargaining chip, and government employees become collateral damage, that is not an effective way to conduct politics, nor is it the right way to do it. As far as the immigration debate concerns, also I've been a practitioner on that as well. I mean, I've been a visa officer in several of my assignments as a diplomat. I've seen firsthand how the immigration system works. There are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people that live in the United States because I issued them immigrant visas at the time at the embassies I was at so that they could come and legally move there. And I know there's lots of problems with our immigration system, and lots of room for reform and lots of room for debate. I don't think we're seeing debate right now. I think we're seeing hostage taking.
Hostage taking. Just to remind us, how did that shutdown of 20-some years ago finish? For who was the winner? Was it Clinton or was it Gingrich?
I think I have to admit I don't remember. Maybe some of our other panelists.
I sense a tinge of irony in that answer. No, but tell our viewers what lesson you draw from how that ended. Will it be the same? Because last time it was the Republicans who
it's also
who suffered afterwards. They were blamed for it.
A similar sort of issue that comes up often is lifting the debt ceiling, and that's another one that's used as a bargaining chip, sort of in these conflicts between the two parties, in these very difficult conflicts. You can't make commitments and engagements on behalf of the American people and then renege on them because you're not getting your way politically. That's not the right thing to do. And I think that the Democrats are very much politically in the right position here, because they're just saying, look, we want to open the government. We can have the debate about the wall or immigration or whatever if you want to do that afterwards. Let's get this government open. And I think I can only think at some point Donald Trump is going to have to sign a bill that allows the government to open up again, or the part of it that's closed. And I can't imagine that's going to come about because the Democrats give him $5.7 billion for a wall.
They don't give him $5.7 billion for a wall, but he could be a winner in the sense that he'll have shown that he stood tough.
So I think the other piece of the whole debate around the wall and the shutdown is not only is his base against immigration, not just undocumented workers, but immigration in general from people, non-white people. The other issue aside from immigration is around the role of public sector workers, government employees, right? So the far right, conservatives, people who support Trump, are very critical of public sector unions, of big government, is what they call it, against government intrusion. And for them, in many ways, they're not as sympathetic to the government employees who are not having a paycheck and able to
And
pay their rent.
certainly with Gingrich, it was against big government. This, though, is not quite the same thing, is it?
Right. So certainly that's not the talking point, right? But what was interesting is that I didn't hear Trump really provide any sympathy in his talk for the government employees that were out of work, right? And so this may not be a main talking point, but again, it has the support of much of his base.
In that clip we heard at the very outset of the show from Donald Trump, Sherri Berman, the U.S. president asks, why do wealthy politicians build walls, fences, and gates around their homes? He's not saying why do wealthy people. He's saying why do wealthy politicians? It's Donald Trump taking on the political class.
Well, I mean, the specific reference is an odd one because there's this kind of, spat that's been going on about Trump accusing former President Obama of having basically a wall around his house, which is just factually incorrect. There have been pictures of the house. There is security because he's a former president, but not a wall. And I think what he was trying to do, again, was not only Democrats, but to kind of make this fear-based point, right, which is that, people build walls because they're scared of what's outside, or as he put it, because they want to protect the people who are inside. But again, this is at the very least a huge exaggeration of what is going on, particularly with Obama. But I think more generally, the wall, as one of your previous guests points out, is simply not even the best way to stop illegal immigration, even if you think it is a major challenge. There are simply much more effective ways of dealing with that. The fact that he's focused on the wall is for its symbolic value. He is riling up a base that is obsessed with the idea of illegal immigration, that believes that it represents a huge security threat, which again, there is almost no empirical evidence for whatsoever. And it's his kind of stand, right? He is willing to shut down the government to build this very symbolic wall that won't even solve the problem that ostensibly he is trying to deal with, namely illegal immigrants. So the whole thing has become, again, a way, as, again, some of your previous speakers have pointed out, of appealing to his base rather than dealing with a legitimate problem or engaging in a legitimate debate, which the Democrats, I believe, have said more than one time that they are willing to discuss. He does not want to discuss. He does not want to debate. He wants to rile up his base because that is where his political support is coming from. And so I think this is a difficult situation for him.
And in the long term, who's the winner out of this standoff?
Well, it depends on who blinks first. I can't imagine the Democrats will blink, but you could see in his speech, that is to say President Trump's speech last night, a very strong attempt to reframe the debate. Again, he uses the term humanitarian crisis as well as security crisis, trying to kind of make him appear less kind of, as the ogre that Democrats have tried to make him out to be. And he's trying to portray it as a crisis, that is to say something worthy of shutting the government down for. If he is able to kind of win that rhetorical debate, then the Democrats will pay a price. I do not believe the facts are on his side. And so hopefully the Democrats will force him to blink and we can have a real debate on immigration, which, again, is a totally normal thing in a democracy. But shutting down the government to build a wall that will not solve any problems, but will simply appeal to the symbolic desire to keep the other out, that's not the way democratic politics works.
We're watching Jeffrey Hawkins here in Europe. The mass influx of migrants that we saw in 2015 has slowed to a trickle, and yet country after country, we're seeing the far right score political wins over the fear of the return of those migrants. So does it matter whether or not they're coming in large numbers?
No, I mean, in that sense, in that purely political sense, of course it doesn't. There's an option that we haven't talked about yet, and we probably need to, and that's the president declaring a national emergency. If I were Donald Trump, I don't believe this is either the right thing to do or probably in the interests of the country. But if I were Donald Trump, I'd say forget trying to negotiate with Congress over the shutdown. I'm going to do the national emergency thing. I'm going to declare this emergency. I'm going to appropriate the funds myself. It's going to get challenged in court. Who cares what happens to that after it? I can sign an appropriation bill opening the government again because I've defended the wall and I did something really dramatic to implement that. And then what happens afterwards, I suspect probably doesn't matter that much to him. And if I were him, that's what I'd be doing. And we'll have to see. He's still negotiating with Congress. Obviously, he was on the Hill today. But I would look for that in the next few days. That's certainly a possibility.
Andrew Good, you agree?
Well, I want, before we get too far away from it, going back to the merits of border barriers and border fencing, it's very clear that border fencing works to stop illegal crossings. Now, you can say that that's not the main problem, or you can say it's not the only problem with illegal immigration. We know that we have a significant visa overstay issue that the wall is not going to take care of, but.
And also the fact that most of the illegal migrants are coming in through places like airports.
Well, I mean, visa overstays is the largest percent of new illegal immigrant, the new additions to the illegal immigrant population in America. And I think everyone agrees on that, and I think that's clear in the data. The question about how much to do and what to do in terms of stopping illegal crossings between ports of entry is where the fencing and wall question lies, whatever you want to call the barriers. Now, we know that the San Diego fence, which is really kind of the first fence, the first place where it was desperately needed and has worked incredibly effectively, and was designed ultimately. I mean, they initially put up, under George H.W. Bush, they initially put up a single layer pedestrian fence, and wound up after asking Sandia Labs to analyze what the best fencing option would be, they wound up with this triple layer fencing, which is more or less what we're talking about at this point. We're not talking about concrete walls, and we're also not talking about the full 2,000 miles of the border. Even Trump hasn't said at any point in time that he wants a wall from all 2,000 miles. Like, we know there's about 1,000 miles of natural barriers where it's extremely difficult to cross, and a wall wouldn't get you any more benefit. So we're talking about the areas that aren't, the half of the border where you could do infrastructure that might make a difference on illegal crossing. So I just want to make sure that we are very clear about what kinds of barriers we're talking about, and the fact that, look, we can argue about whether a cost-benefit analysis. We happen to see that illegal immigration in general is very costly, more costly than border barriers. But you can argue that, well, it's not worth it, or it sends some kind of a bad message. Those are all fine arguments to have, but we do know that it's effective, which is why no one's going to San Diego and saying, hey, we should take down this triple layer fencing because it's ineffective, or we no longer want it. Nobody's saying that.
$5.7 billion. It's a lot of money. Let me ask you, Jen Trady, just we've seen on this continent in the past couple of years, a lot of the vote for Brexit was a fear of immigrants, the rise of the far right in many places, the yellow vest movement, a sense of disenfranchisement, but also a fear of competition coming from abroad. At the end of the day, I asked the question that I asked to the rest of the panel: who's going to be the political winner from this shutdown standoff?
Well, I think if we, I take a long view of politics, right? And I think it's really important to contextualize what's happening in France versus England versus the United States, right? So immigration, especially recently in France and Europe, certainly is the result primarily of war, et cetera. So when we think about the winners and the losers, we also have to think about who are the people who are being forced to leave their countries in the first place, right? And will they win or lose by whether or not there's a wall or whether or not countries are letting people in by boats. And that's the thing that, sitting here in France, it's very interesting to hear the talk about a wall, because as we've seen the amazing life risk-taking that migrants have faced trying to get to Europe and crossing the Mediterranean, many of whom are dying, that a wall really won't solve any of those problems. And I think the real losers at this point are, immigrants who are facing these dire situations, whether it's the threat of violence in Central America or here on this side of the Atlantic.
On that point, Andrew Good, should the President of the United States be applying more pressure on the President of Guatemala, who's just scrapped an International Human Rights Commission and support rule of law? Because we haven't heard Donald Trump on that issue.
Anything that we can do to use our diplomatic resources to help the situation of people who are, living under the threat of violence or under the, under oppression, under oppressive regimes worldwide is something I think, I think there's broad agreement on that.
So the president should be speaking up.
Well, if he's not, I think that this is an area that's easy to find a lot of agreement on, because, we want to see free people around the world and people who are, prospering in their home countries. Because I think you run into this situation with migration, there have to be limits, and those limits are going to be humanely enforced. At least that is the will of the constituents, of the voters of America. We want to see illegal immigration ended.
All right,
and we want to see the
be
limits that Congress passes enforced.
All right, that's going to be, unfortunately, our final word, because we're running short on time. Andrew Good, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Arlington, Virginia. I want to thank as well Sherri Berman in New York City, Jeffrey Hawkins, Jen Schrady. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.